Welcome, everyone, to our very last lecture of the semester. By popular vote, you guys chose to learn a little bit more about Napoleon. Now, I'm not going to be actually talking that much about Napoleon. I'm going to be talking about Napoleon and Britain's response to Napoleon. So this is really a snapshot of the Napoleonic Wars, but only in as much as the British are involved in it, since our class is of Great Britain or England that has transitioned into Great Britain. And here we are at the end of it. So when we talk about Napoleon as an introduction, we need to understand that this guy was not actually a Frenchman. He was from Italy. And therefore, from Italy, you're going to have this fellow that is born to a wealthy family in Corsica, and he's going to be moving to France. His parents paid for him to go to France to take classes at a military high school that then, of course, went into an officer training school. And from there, his talents are going to be revealed in the French Revolution. And during the French Revolution, a Napoleon who was 5'6", all right, he was actually average size for his era of time. You probably know plenty of people who are actually a little bit shorter than 5'6" and taller. And so he's actually kind of average for our era too. And so he wasn't short. That was all from British propaganda during the war to try to make him seem less scary to people while they were trying to figure out if they could beat him in a war in Europe. And so the deal is that Napoleon was a very unique thinker. He was fast on his toes. He was great at adapting, and he inspired great love from his people, from his men who followed him. He was one of those kind of charismatic people that you do not necessarily find everywhere you go. And so this guy was a natural leader. Where does he become famous? During the French Revolution, he actually is going to join the revolutionary side, and he's going to lead armies of France against invaders. Because during the French Revolution, while you've got a civil war between the common people of France against the government of France, you're also going to have foreign nations that ally with the government of France, the King of France and his family, to invade to try to put down the revolution so that other revolutions and other parts of Europe do not start. They're hoping, of course, that the French Revolution is a unique one-time movement that will be ended by some um, military power. Okay, and so the end result is that Napoleon's going to defeat all foreign armies that invade France by using his superior military strategy that people are just really not ready to handle. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about his military strategy because that plays a role in this whole story. I've got some imagery for you that I'm going to explain. But the basic deal is that you've got a guy who is famous for his rapid attacks and for attacking mostly when other people are not ready to defend. So let me try to explain this. First of all, I want to start here really. Promoted skill in his army and not heritage. In the armies of Europe, including that of Great Britain, it was very common for officers to be people who were wealthy that purchased a commission in the Navy or in the Army. By that, I mean you've got a wealthy person who is going to pay for their child to join the Army as a lower ranked commissioned officer and then move up the ranks as they earn that reward of being promoted. And therefore, the position of ensign in most of these European armies, ensign was the entry level. I paid for this position of for my child, right? The entry level position that then went from ensign to lieutenant to captain to major and colonel and finally general. And then there's some middle ranks in the middle there, right? And these are not necessarily people that are going to be good leaders or be good at military strategy. These are people who were simply wealthy enough to buy their way in, kind of like the American college scandal thing with all the Hollywood people and stuff buying their kids into college positions by saying they were on sports teams that didn't exist or whatever. And so that's really what this is. Napoleon was very different in that he took common people who were skilled but were not able to buy their way into the higher echelon of the military, and he promoted people up the ranks, which was very rare. For instance, if you had a common private in the British Army that common private would never make it above sergeant because you had to be born as a noble to start as an ensign and move up the ranks. Whereas in the French army under Napoleon, you could start as a private, and as it turns out, you're really good at leading people, and you're really good at strategy, and yet you were born poor. Guess what? Napoleon will promote you, and the people love this about him because he basically triumphed. Napoleon triumphed over the order of the age, and so he had in his first 5 years as a military commander, Napoleon is going to have some of the best commanders and veteran soldiers in the world. He's going to have good ones. Now he's going to fight so much as he moves forward that he's going to lose a lot of them to death and retirement, while Napoleon himself keeps on going and ends up having to recruit less good soldiers over time. So we'll talk about that as we go. Let me introduce this then. Why is it that Napoleon is able to use this thing called the central position? And it's linked to the fact that he had really good soldiers and officers based on the way that he promoted people for skill. So a central position, the key to why Napoleon won battle after battle against the famous Prussians, who were hard to beat at the time, against the Swedes, against the Danes, against the Austrians, and against the Russians. How did Napoleon trounce all those professional armies? And the way he does it is not just speed, right? It's this thing called the center position. Now, the center position that Napoleon does is he would take his full army and move to a battlefield that he wanted to use, but there were no other armies there. It's just that he went to that battlefield knowing that at some point an army like the Austrians or whoever were going to come and face him. Now, the way that other countries would get their armies together, this is not all that uncommon, is they would seek their alliances. So maybe the Austrians would ally with some of the Italian states and with the Prussians. And so the Austrian army might be sitting here somewhere, and it's going to be waiting for the Italian army to show up and the Prussian army to show up, right? And eventually you'll have this one big coalition army that can go up against Napoleon's army. So to avoid that, what Napoleon would do is he would go to the battlefield that at some point there will be a big battle at, and then he would break his army apart and send commanders that he trusted, people that he promoted that were like him. And he would send commanders to send smaller parts of his army to hold off the other incoming allied armies of his enemies. And so he would go after, let's say, for instance, the Italian army that's coming in, that's supposed to join the Austrian army. And then he sends another unit to go stop the Prussian army, for instance. And these guys don't have to win, although they often did. They don't have to win these smaller French units. They just have to stop these guys. And so while these other armies are stopped, then Napoleon can force this other bigger army to commit, beat them, and then Napoleon can go and help finish off these other armies that he had his men delay. The center position is basically, to put it in other words, divide and conquer. And that's what he would do. It was just a brilliant strategy that other armies were just not used to dealing with. Okay, it wasn't very common. Usually, it was kind of Pyrrhic. You would wait, and the other army would form, and at some point they both meet on the battlefield, and it's this big kind of chess game between the two sides. And instead, Napoleon just did everything different, and therefore he's going to be a winner. Well, let's talk about where Napoleon goes from just being a leader during the French Revolution to the Emperor of France, and that'll finally bring us to the British. Okay, so it's 1798, towards the tail end of the French Revolutionary era. And 1798 to 1801, Napoleon is going to already have made himself pretty famous in France. What that means is that the French government, which wasn't all that great, the Directory is what it was called, the French government is not really comfortable with Napoleon being around, because Napoleon is so popular by the time we get to 1798 that there's fear that he might take over the government. So Napoleon is sent with a fairly moderate army, like 20,000 guys, to go into Egypt to basically wage a campaign there. Maybe capture Egypt for France or something like that, with 20,000 guys, which was not going to happen. That's not a big enough army. But basically, Napoleon is sent away to go fight for the glory of France, mostly to get rid of him. And so Napoleon is going to go into Egypt, and he's going to defeat every Ottoman Egyptian army that comes after him. He's going to beat all of them. He's also going to have a couple of years there where he can have his scientists from France study the pyramids. They're going to discover the famous Rosetta Stone, which is what's going to allow scientists to learn how to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs, because this has 3 different languages on it. One of the languages we knew, which was Greek, but we didn't know these other 2, and so including hieroglyphs. So during the early 1800s, people of the world are going to learn how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs because they can compare it to the ancient Greek that's on this one stone that has 3 different versions of the same government order on it. So right here, this language we don't know. This one here, no one has translated it yet, even though we've got this ancient Greek version and the now translated hieroglyphic version. This one is still untranslated, so there's your PhD history majors or linguist majors. Anyway, so what happens is Napoleon is running around Egypt, right? Conquering, beating enemies, looting things, looting ancient Egyptian shrines and pyramids and tombs, right? And then what happens is the British, getting a little fed up with this, are going to send an army in to try to chase him down. The British wanted Egypt. The British were spending time in Egypt, and they did not want France getting Egypt. So for the first time, the Brits get involved against Napoleon. And so, I mean, not really the first time, but the first time directly. And so the British send their navy in, and the British Navy, under Horatio Nelson, which is a very famous admiral, is going to go to the Nile River, where it meets the Mediterranean Ocean. And at the Nile, August 1st through 3rd in 1798, the British Navy is going to destroy the French Navy. The problem with this is that that French Navy was how Napoleon was supposed to get home. That was his bus ride home, was that French Navy. There was no other way for him to get out. But that was the plan. So the Ottomans on one side and the British landing an army over on the other side of Africa. And then you've got the British Navy in support destroying the French fleet. So the idea was, I'm going to go to this picture. The idea was that Napoleon would get stuck in Egypt, and then the British army could come and kind of sandwich him between the British and the Ottomans, and therefore they could beat him and capture Napoleon, and that would be it, right? That was the whole idea. Well, ultimately, Napoleon has gone through and won a bunch of big battles and looted a bunch of stuff all throughout this region, pretty much unopposed, except by weaker armies than what he had. And when his fleet's destroyed, Napoleon does something very interesting. Okay, you have all these images of the battles of the Turks versus the French, and all these things, right? The end result, guys, is that Napoleon, I kid you not, I bet you haven't heard this about him. Napoleon wants to get away. He wants to escape and not be captured by the British. So Napoleon leaves his French army behind to be captured and gets onto a boat up here with a couple of advisors and heads back to Italy. And then from Italy, he's going to go back to France. And he's going to come back to France as a hero, even though he left the French army behind to be captured by the British. And so he's going to do that once again in his career, just FYI. We'll talk about that too. But that's how Napoleon escapes the British Navy and Army who were coming in to get him. Okay? So, we call it the Great Chase. And so that's what happens here. Napoleon has successfully made a name for himself. This is just the battle scene here, where the British Navy comes in and wipes out the French Navy that is at the Nile that's supposed to take Napoleon home. And so the British thought they were going to capture Napoleon, and therefore that would not be a problem. And by the time Napoleon is in Egypt, he's already managed to beat massive armies in both Italy and Austria. So when we get to Egypt, Napoleon's already very feared, and therefore the British were hoping to capture him here. Doesn't work. Okay, so moving on, it's just another image of the Battle of the Nile. Moving on, we have what happens afterwards. Napoleon has snuck home. Napoleon walks into France as a big hero because he has snuck past the English and managed to win a bunch of victories in Egypt under the French flag, the French Revolutionary flag. In 1802, the Directory, the government of France, promotes him to consul, which means he is a leader for life. In 1804, he simply crowns himself the emperor and gets rid of the old French government. And then he's going to hold an election. And the election means that Napoleon is calling himself a democratically elected emperor. The reality is that he did this a lot. He held these plebiscites, which is just, the people voting. And the reality is that the people always voted for whatever Napoleon wanted, somehow, amazingly. And Napoleon, you guys, was a dictator, okay? He was an enlightened dictator, meaning he knew how to apply Enlightenment theories to organizing a better France, but he also knew how to scare people into submission. Napoleon had his own version of a Gestapo, a secret police. Napoleon was brutal to people who opposed him. So just keep it in mind, he's not some super nice guy. He's just really good at warfare and at influencing the people, okay? So that's by 1804, the guy is now an emperor of France, and he is feared by the British, by the Ottomans, by the Austrians, by the Italians, and by the Prussians. So what's going to happen next? Okay, so what's going to happen next as we jump forward is that between 1804 and 1810, Napoleon is going to have conquered all of what will become Germany one day. He will have conquered all of Italy. He will have scared the Austrians into joining the Napoleonic Empire. He will have defeated the Prussians and forced them to join Napoleon's empire as a subsidiary tributary state. He's going to conquer Denmark. He's going to conquer Norway. And therefore, Napoleon has made himself a little empire. I think he could have kept it if that's all he did. If he had stayed here, I think he could have kept this empire. Maybe he could have even gone in and captured Istanbul at some point. All right. But if he had stayed here, I think he's got it. But like people that are conquerors, Alexander the Great, Caesar, Napoleon, Hitler, like these kinds of people, they find the game is only fun when they're actually conquering things. They want to keep playing the game. And so Napoleon is not going to stop, all right? There's two things that Napoleon really wants to do. He wants to conquer England, and to get there, he needs to go through Spain and Portugal. That's a story we will tell. And he wants to conquer the Russian Empire. And in theory, he could, because the Russian army was really quite weak at the time. So the idea of conquering Russia was really just one of space. How long will it take to do, as opposed to whether he could do it? So Napoleon has to figure this out. Now, Napoleon has about 1 million men to serve in his army. They're people that come from France, his most loyal soldiers. He's also got people that he's forced to join the army from all these other regions that he's conquered. So some of these soldiers are French patriots, and some of them are not. Okay, they're people that have been forced to serve, and they're being paid well, so they're happy to do it, many of them, but they're not going to stick it through as well as the native French army. Regardless of that, Napoleon is going to do two things roughly at the same time. He's going to send one army into Spain to conquer Spain, and he's going to send another army guided by himself into Russia. Okay, so he's going to attack both fronts at the same time. Even Hitler didn't do that. Okay, that's insane, but Napoleon was that kind of guy, all right? Now, there is a moment where Napoleon does try to capture England, and that's why England is going to suddenly get wholesale involved in fighting Napoleon. The little bit that happened down here in Egypt was kind of a moment where the British thought that they could just do an action and capture the guy and therefore stop anything that might happen in the future, and it didn't work. But the entire British military was not involved in a death struggle against Napoleon. But now they're going to be. And what happens is this. While Napoleon is sending an army into Spain, and while Napoleon is starting to prepare to invade Russia, he takes a fleet of warships. They're captured Italian warships, captured Spanish warships, some captured Danish warships, and Napoleon, of course, has his own French warships, and he's going to take this massive fleet of warships full of soldiers, and they're going to be sailing this way, heading for England. They're going to go and invade England and try to make a foothold there. And so the French army is on all these ships, and right about here, the English Navy stops them. And there's this big battle called the Battle of Trafalgar. And that Battle of Trafalgar, the British perspective, besides Egypt, was just to wait for Napoleon to kind of stop and then let Europe figure it out. Because the British were thinking that maybe the Austrians, the Russians, the Prussians, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Danish, the Spanish, the Portuguese could deal with Napoleon on their own, and Britain could just keep on doing what they were doing. And then finally, you got this big French fleet in 1805 heading to England to invade England. And right off the coast of Trafalgar, you have this huge naval battle. And when that happened, that big naval battle happened that the English won, the British people started to realize that they needed to get ready for a bigger fight against Napoleon. Because at some point, Napoleon's going to come and conquer England like he's conquered everything else. And so the English people suddenly realize, oh crap, we're in deep trouble, okay? So we see the British Navy being called into blockade duty to keep an eye on all the French warships and transports of Europe. They'll be doing that for about 10 years. And then we have an English Navy that's going to be invading Portugal at the invitation of Portugal, because Napoleon is going to send his armies into Portugal after Spain. Those armies are going to behave as badly in Portugal as they do in Spain, the looting, the raping, the killing. And the French armies are going to be faced by very good Portuguese forces that are just not big enough to beat all of Napoleon's forces. And so the British show up to help stop the French in Portugal. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Regarding the Battle of Trafalgar, when the British get involved, this is a huge event in English history. The English Navy is famously good, but the French Navy was bigger because it had captured all these other warships. And the French Navy, if the French had won the Battle of Trafalgar, the alternate history would be that England would have been invaded. It would have been a very different world today. And so this battle is huge. Here's why this was so different. I just want to put this battle plan up. The French fleet, with all their captured ships, like the Spanish and the Danes and all that, huge navy of ships heading to England, right? And the British Navy comes in, and they don't do what they're supposed to do. The way the British Navy is supposed to act is they're supposed to line up right alongside the enemy fleet, and then there's supposed to be a big giant gun duel between the navies, and the winners are the ones that are still floating at the end, right? It's a very brutal, basic system of battle. Well, what happens is Admiral Nelson of the British fleet he was like the Napoleon of the sea, okay? And Admiral Nelson is going to take the British warships. They're going to sail right into the middle of the French fleet. And while these ships here, they can't fight because they can't turn around. The wind's blowing the wrong way. And these ships don't get there in time before the entire middle of the French fleet is destroyed or captured. And that means these guys, as they slowly show up, are either going to be entering in on their own against these guys because everybody else is gone or captured, or these guys are going to get scared and simply turn away and sail off. So basically, this entire British fleet only has to defeat these ships right here. And that's what they do. These guys sail away and escape, and most of these guys sail away and escape, and the British Navy has destroyed most of the French Navy by the time this thing is over, and the French will never again, ever again, try to invade France, or Britain, excuse me. So that's the Battle of Trafalgar. Here's a quick video for you. Okay, so there you go, huh? Pretty major event. All right, a couple more things happen. 1805, the British are now involved, all right, because of the Battle of Trafalgar. The British realize that they have to do something to stop Napoleon from trying to invade again. And so what happens is we come down to here, all right? Napoleon is no longer going to try to invade England, but he would love England to create a peace treaty with them so that Napoleon knows that the British will not get involved any further. And so Napoleon creates this thing called the Continental System. And the Continental System was a form of economic warfare designed to hurt the British economy and therefore force the British into a peace treaty. So what that means is that Napoleon is saying nobody can trade with Napoleonic Europe. Let me show you that map again, guys. This is kind of a big deal. Napoleon owns everything from Spain all the way to Austria, and up here controls the Baltic Sea. Okay? So what that means is Napoleon has the Continental System. The Continental System says this: any foreign trade, like American trade, for instance, that wants to come in and trade with Europe has to come to France first. Okay? And if those ships go to England first, then the French simply will not trade with them. So you can kind of tell where ships have been because logs are kept and whatnot. So that's the deal, guys, is Napoleon says you either trade with the French Empire or you trade with Britain. But you're not going to make as much money with Britain. You're going to make more money with us. So come to our empire and trade here. And that was just meant to kind of force people to pick sides. Okay, that's really what happens. And so the idea was that it was supposed to hurt the British economy, this continental system. Britain responds by putting a blockade around all of Western Europe. It's a huge blockade, all right? This huge blockade around all of Western Europe. And all those British warships are going to stop any other ships from getting to France. And so basically there is a trade war going on between Britain and France. Now here's the thing. Britain can get all of the supplies it needs from its colonies. It has a global colonial network, whereas France can only work with what it has on the continent. So the British are really going to do a better job hurting the French economically than the French are going to do hurting the British, okay? Now, here's what happens, things that just get kind of crazy here. Continental system's going to fail. You know, the French attempt to try to get people to only trade with French-occupied Europe fails. How do we know it fails? Russia's going to leave. Russia had joined the continental system as an alliance with France, and Russia wants to trade with America and other nations. And so Russia's going to leave the continental system, which is going to spark a really bad move on the part of Napoleon. So we'll talk about that more later. So here we have the propaganda war begins after the Battle of Trafalgar, and as things are heating up between the British and the French. You've got little Napoleon. This is where you start seeing him drawn as a short guy, even though he wasn't. Little Napoleon trying to carve out his part of the world, and the British Empire trying to carve out their part of the world, right? You see here patriotic songs being written and sung about British glory and how they're going to go and fight and defeat the French. We have more British poems, right, made and published, where you have a little Napoleon in a big taco hat going up against, you know, a standard British authority. You've got, again, stories about how the British Navy has fought and suffered against the French Navy, but won anyway, right? The sacrifices of our soldiers against the great evil. So this is all the stuff that's going on as the British begin to ramp up their wish to fight Napoleon. Okay, so 1807, Napoleon has defeated Russia 2 times, and therefore the Tsar, the king of Russia, makes peace with Napoleon. And the Tsar of Russia makes out pretty well. In this peace treaty, there's Napoleon, right? In this peace treaty, the Russians get to do all kinds of things that they wanted to do anyway. All right. Basically, Napoleon does not worry about Russia attacking the Ottomans, which is what the Russians were already doing, about getting some islands in the Med Sea for trade, about going in and invading Finland, all right, going into Prussia and fighting the Prussians for space and money and land and the whole thing, right? In return, the Russians had to support the continental system, meaning the Russians agreed not to trade with England or any of England's colonies. And that's going to hurt Russia, because they were already trading a lot with America and English colonies, right? And so now the Russians can only trade with Napoleon's people, and that's not so good for them. So what happens is Russia's going to leave this alliance, and when that happens, Napoleon wants to go punish Russia. So we'll talk about that, all right? This is just a slide about what the continental system was. I'm not sure how much you need it. It's just, I'm just gonna go here. Ultimately did more damage to Europe than do to the British. America is going to be declaring war on England at some point here, though, because the English are forcing Americans to trade only with England and not with France. And so there's going to be this war of 1812 that's partially about that and a few other things, but that's for a U.S. history course. And so that finally comes up to this. The British have their colonies, which allows them to survive during the continental system economic war between France and England. So Russia, not doing well, though, in the continental system that France has set up, leaves in 1812. And so Napoleon gets really mad. All right. Here's the British blockade of France, of all French territories. Very expensive blockade. You have to maintain all those warships all over Western Europe. It's the biggest blockade in history until the U.S. Civil War, when the United States has a giant blockade against the South. Okay, so what goes wrong? All right, what things go wrong? First of all, Napoleon's troops are going to invade Spain and Portugal, and as I mentioned, Napoleon's troops treat the Spanish people and the Portuguese people very badly. As a result, these people rise up as partisan guerrilla fighters, families of Spanish and Portuguese fighting against the French wherever the French went. So although the French are defeating the armies of Portugal and of Spain, the people, millions of people, rise up to attack baggage trains and to snipe at the French army as it's moving through the mountains of Spain and Portugal, that sort of thing, right? It's really hard to beat these guys. It's kind of like the Napoleon's version of Vietnam. And so Napoleon is going to send troops across Spain to go attack Portugal. At the same time, Spain falls to Napoleon, and so he makes his brother the king of France or of Spain, and that's not going to go over well with the Spanish. The Spanish begin to fight guerrilla warfare. It's a huge country, so the French army is going to be under attack every day and every night during the Peninsular War, which is the war against Spain and Portugal. Okay, maintaining supply lines between France and the French armies in Spain and Portugal is going to be very hard now because of all these guerrilla fighters that are the result of a bad French handling of the citizens of these countries. Goya, I don't know if you've heard of a guy named Francisco Goya, but he was a Spanish artist who painted and sketched a lot of drawings of the horrors of how the French treated the local Spanish and Portuguese people. The firing squads, right? The bodily harm, the actual partisans, this woodsman here rising up against the French, these guys with these big mustaches and the shako hats and stuff. The French who were doing horrible things, like a patriotic call to guerrilla warfare for the Spanish people. You've got, of course, locals being hung brutally by the, there's like supposed to be thousands of them here, brutally hung by these French people. You've got scenes like this of rape between the French army and all the poor Spanish and Portuguese women that were captured. These things really happened. Also, brutal murders would happen. The British Army, when they were marching through Spain, would come across entire towns where all the people of the town were simply rounded up. The women were raped, and then everybody was put into a church, and the church set on fire. Like that sort of thing was done quite often by the French in these countries, and therefore the people had no reason to love the French, right, or to support the French in any way. The French were just awful to the Spanish and Portuguese. So this is going to go slow. The invasion of the Spanish peninsula is going to go slow because of all the pushback by the Spanish and Portuguese people. In the middle of all this, in the middle of a long, slow occupation of Spain and Portugal, Napoleon gets mad at Russia because Russia leaves the continental system, as I mentioned. And so what that means is that Napoleon is going to get mad. He's going to put Spain and Portugal's rule under the control of his brother, who is bad at this, and some generals who are okay at this, but didn't have the support. And those guys continue to try to conquer Spain and Portugal. And meanwhile, Napoleon is going to raise a 650,000-man army and invade Russia. Okay, so all this is going to happen at the same time. Yes, Napoleon is going to fight a two-front war, ladies and gentlemen. So 650,000 men invade Russia on June 22nd, 1812. By the way, weird side note is that 129 years later, Hitler is going to invade Russia the same day, June 22nd. Hitler did that on purpose. That's another story. Okay, so the Russians will destroy, they do a scorched earth policy. The Russians don't actually fight the French for the first 1,000 miles. They just destroy everything so that the French have no food to eat. The French can't feed off the land. All right. The Russians will do the same thing against the Nazis. So Napoleon's going to make it, unlike the Nazis, Napoleon makes it all the way to Moscow, occupies the city, but the Russian army still isn't there. You know, they're still kind of hiding. And the Tsar Alexander, is actually hiding in St. Petersburg at the time. So he's not there either. So Napoleon has gotten to the capital of Russia, and there's nobody to fight. And the citizens, on purpose, under orders, will set the capital of Moscow on fire. Prisoners are let out of prisons, the whole deal, and they set Moscow on fire so that Napoleon and his troops have nowhere to hide. They can't be there because winter's coming. You know, like in Game of Thrones, winter's coming, and Napoleon is stuck. He has to find somewhere to live the winter out. He was going to shelter in Moscow for the entire winter, and instead, Moscow set itself on fire. So Napoleon is just leaving Moscow as winter hits. You guys, it's going to be minus 22 degrees. Minus 22. If you don't know what that is, it means things freeze. Everything freezes, okay? It's terrible, all right? It's just really, really bad. So what happens is Napoleon's army is now going to be attacked by the Russians during the winter. But it's really the winter that kills Napoleon's army as opposed to the Russian army. It's just the fact that Napoleon took these guys way too far because he was so mad at the Russians for leaving Napoleon's Continental Alliance system. And so Napoleon's going to do exactly what happened in Egypt, if you remember. He's going to leave his poor army, 650,000 dudes. He's going to leave them to get back to France on their own and heads back to France to spend the PR war and talk about how everything went just great, all right? And so after this, you guys, this is really bad. 650,000 troops follow Napoleon into Russia. 30,000 make it home. 30,000. So that's the beginning of the end of the Napoleonic Empire. It's not that he's done. There's going to be a lot of battles left, but that's the beginning of the end, okay? So he's going to lose 200,000 pack horses and cavalry horses. He's going to lose 570,000 guys, you know, and then others die of attrition. It's a disaster. It's really bad, right? So these scenes of Napoleon in Russia, and meanwhile, the other Napoleonic armies are in Spain, basically surrounded by partisans and trying to maintain control through sheer brutality. There's Moscow on fire. Set on fire on October 19th. Okay, so that gets to the British part, even more so. What happens now? Well, Wellesley, this guy here, Wellesley is going to be the general that is pulled out of India. This guy was actually conquering India for Britain at the time. And Wellesley has conquered most of India, or half of India, really. And he's going to be called as the best general that the British have. He's going to be called out of India so that he can lead the British into Portugal and stop the French in Portugal and maybe start to push the French out of Spain too. So we have the offensive. It finally begins. All right, it's about 1809 as the British begin to fight in Portugal.
Those men who fought in a big battle before. One pace forward. This place is called Talavera. There's going to be a battle here tomorrow. You'll fight in it, maybe even die in it. But you won't see it. There's a lot of smoke in a battle. Our cannon, their cannon. Our shot, their shell. Our volleys, their volleys. You don't see a battle. You hear it. Black powder blasting by the ton on all sides. Black smoke blinding you and choking you and making you vomit. And the French come out of the smoke. Not in a line, but in a column. And they march towards our thin line. Kettle drums hammering like hell, and a golden eagle blazing overhead. They march slowly, and it takes them a long time to reach you. can't see them in smoke, but you can hear the drums. And they march out of the smoke and you fire a volley. And the front rank of the column falls, and the next rank steps over them with drums hammering. And the column smashes your line like a hammer breaking glass. And Napoleon has won another battle. But if you don't run, if you stand until you can smell the garlic, and fire volley after volley, 3 rounds a minute, then they slow down. They stop, and then they run away. All you've got to do is stand and fire 3 rounds a minute. Now, you and I know you can fire 3 rounds a minute. But can you stand?
By 1812, Napoleon's French Empire had 250,000 troops stationed in Spain, bogged down in a war that seemed to have no end. They faced a bitter struggle against the people of Spain, who'd taken up arms in a guerrilla war, as well as the remnants of Spain's field armies and an Anglo-Portuguese army under Lord Wellington. But French forces in Spain remained formidable and in firm control of the capital, Madrid, and most major cities. And the year began with another great French victory in the south, and a calamity for Spain. Spain and Portugal would become a graveyard, not just for young French conscripts, but for the reputation of some of France's most famous generals. General Junot, Marshal Soult, and Marshal Jourdan had all tasted defeat. Marshal Massena had been recalled in disgrace. Marshal Louis-Gabriel Suchet was the exception. French generals in Spain were notorious for their looting, Soult, based in Andalusia, was probably the worst, reckoned to have stolen 1.5 million francs worth of art from Spanish monasteries and churches. As governor of Aragon, Marshal Suchet behaved very differently. He enforced strict discipline on his troops, punishing any who tried to steal or extort money from the Spanish, while treating local authorities with respect. He combined this hearts and minds strategy with ruthless military action against the guerrillas that was able to establish firm control of Aragon. In June 1811, after a particularly bloody assault, Suchet took the port of Tarragona, for which Napoleon rewarded him with his marshal's baton. The emperor then sent him reinforcements and ordered him to take Valencia. First, he routed a much larger Spanish army that attacked him at Saguntum, before he laid siege to Valencia. The city was packed with Spanish troops and refugees, and to avoid starvation, General Blake surrendered Valencia on the 8th of January 1812. The French took 18,000 prisoners, including 23 generals, and nearly 500 guns. It was a devastating blow to the Spanish cause. But to reinforce Suchet, Napoleon had stripped troops from other armies in Spain, and then withdrawn 25,000 of the best troops for his imminent invasion of Russia. The result was that French forces in Spain were now severely overstretched. Wellington was now ready to begin his advance into Spain. Spanish regular forces and guerrilla bands began operations to tie down as many French troops as possible. While from the Bay of Biscay, Sir Hume Popham's naval raiding force made diversionary attacks on French coastal targets. In 4 days, Wellington was at Salamanca, as Marmont, outnumbered, withdrew behind the Douro River. But when reinforcements arrived, he crossed the river again. For 6 days, Marmont tried to march around Wellington's flank, but the British general matched him move for move, their two armies marching in parallel, often within sight of each other. But on the 7th day, Marmont blundered. On the morning of the 22nd of July, Wellington's army occupied high ground 4 miles south of Salamanca. Marmont was not interested in a direct assault. He still sought to outflank Wellington, threaten his line of retreat to Portugal, and force him to fall back. Around 8 AM, the French won a dash for a hill known as the Greater Arapil, which Marmont made his observation point. The French army began to swing round behind him. Marmont had convinced himself that Wellington was an overly cautious general who would not risk attack. The hills hid most of Wellington's army from view, and when Marmont saw dust clouds to the west, he assumed it was Wellington's baggage train leaving Salamanca, beginning their retreat. But it was the British 3rd Division and a Portuguese cavalry brigade moving up to strengthen Wellington's flank, because he wasn't planning a retreat. He was about to attack. Around 2 PM, Marmont ordered the 5 infantry divisions waiting in the woods behind him to march west, to cut off Wellington's imagined retreat. General Moukoun's 5th Division, in the lead, stopped to engage what was presumed to be the British rearguard in the village of Los Arapiles. General Thomier's 7th Division continued west past it. Wellington watched as the French left flank became increasingly strung out. and knew it was an opportunity too good to miss. He galloped 3 miles across country to the 3rd Division to give the crucial orders in person. Many of his staff officers struggled to keep up. On arrival, he instructed the division's commander, his own brother-in-law, Edward Pakenham, to attack and drive everything before him. Third Division's advance was hidden by low hills until the last minute. Thomières's division was caught completely unawares and shattered by the assault. Thomières himself was killed, half his division killed or captured, the rest soon put to flight. At this crucial moment, Marshal Marmont was hit by a British shell and carried from the field seriously wounded. His second-in-command, General Bonnet, was himself wounded an hour later, so command passed to General Clausel. 45 minutes later, the British 5th Division attacked, supported by 2 Portuguese brigades and General Le Marchand's dragoons. The French saw the cavalry coming and formed square, but were hit first by the British infantry, who unleashed a close-range volley, then charged with the bayonet. The French were routed and charged down by Le Marchand's cavalry. French 6th Division was caught up in the collapse. Le Marchand himself was shot from the saddle, but his brigade had helped destroy 8 French battalions and capture 2 Eagles. Wellington's echelon attack continued as Cole's 4th Division advanced in the centre. But Pack's Portuguese brigade was thrown back from the Greater Arapil, and the whole division was soon falling back in disorder. Despite the devastation of his army's left flank, General Clausel decided to launch an attack on the Lesser Arapil, the hinge of Wellington's position. If it could be taken, he might still snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But the French advance was met by fresh troops of Clinton's 6th Division, who poured volleys of musket fire into the French columns. They began to fall back. The French army had lost the will to fight on, its soldiers streaming away into the woods behind them. General Ferré's 3rd Division mounted a brave rearguard action to buy the rest of the army time to escape, but it faced a hopeless task. It was soon outflanked by the British 5th Division, and Ferré himself was killed. Only General Foy's 1st Division escaped in good order. With darkness falling and his army exhausted, Wellington called off the pursuit. Wellington had smashed Marmont's army, taking 7,000 prisoners and killing or wounding 6,000 more, a French casualty rate of 25%, and more than double Wellington's own losses. The next day, dragoons of the King's German Legion attacked the French rearguard and achieved the almost unheard-of feat of charging down a French infantry square and taking another 1,000 prisoners. Wellington now decided to march on Madrid, forcing King Joseph to abandon the capital and retreat to Valencia to join up with Marshal Suchet. On the 12th of August, Wellington liberated the city to scenes of wild celebration. Soult, now at risk of being cut off in Andalusia, abandoned the siege of Cadiz, which had dragged on for 2.5 years, and marched east to join Joseph and Suchet. The following month, Wellington marched north, pushing the French back from Valladolid and besieging the castle of Burgos. But his army lacked heavy guns, and the French garrison fought bravely. as powerful French armies gathered to the north and south. Wellington himself was now in danger of being trapped. He had no choice but to withdraw. Wellington's retreat turned into a desperate, forced march through autumn rain. The supply system collapsed, and many starving soldiers looted what food they could find from Spanish villages. Madrid was abandoned and reoccupied by the French on the 1st of November. Wellington was back where he'd started 5 months before. But despite the campaign's dismal conclusion, his strike into Spain had led to the liberation of huge swathes of the country and left the French more overstretched than ever. Reinforced and resupplied, Wellington would be back the next year to deliver the final blow to Joseph's Spanish kingdom. 1812 had seen the tide of war turn, and not just in Spain, because 2,000 miles to the east, in Russia, catastrophe had engulfed La Grande Armée.
March 31st, 1814, when Napoleon surrenders, and Napoleon is going to be exiled to a prison on the island of Elba. What does that look like? I want to show you this. The island of Elba is right here, okay? So if there was an easily escapable situation for this guy, that was it. Why did the British not kill Napoleon? The reason being is because doing so would have martyred him, all right? The French people would have probably kept fighting and would have risen up the way the Spanish people did and the Portuguese did against the French. And so the idea was to not kill him, but rather to treat him with some kind of respect as a political prisoner. And that's what they did. 100 days later, Napoleon escapes Elba with some supporters, and he gets back to France. March 1st, he lands in France, okay? Louis, the not well-supported king of France, sends an entire army to capture him. That army shows up, and Napoleon gets off his horse and standing in front of that army, he says, "Soldiers of the 5th, you recognize me. If any man would shoot his emperor, he may do so now." And what happened is all those French guys emotionally simply defected and joined Napoleon. So Napoleon now has an army. So King Louis of France sends 2 more armies. And those 2 more armies show up, they get to Napoleon, and they join him too. So Napoleon now has a big army. And he says this, he actually sends a letter back to Louis. This is just a little piece of trolling. It says to Louis, "Thank you for the soldiers, but please don't send any more. I have all I need." And that was enough chutzpah to force Louis to run away. So he runs away. Napoleon comes back to Paris with the now allied French armies, and Napoleonic War number 2 begins. The town of Waterloo in Belgium, where this big fight is going to happen, is going to be a 10-hour, it's freaking crazy, 2 huge armies. And they're going to be fighting for 10 hours long.
Sunday dawns bright and fair. Napoleon has ordered Marshal Grouchy to pursue the Prussians and keep them busy, while he defeats Wellington's army at Waterloo and opens the road to Brussels. But it's Grouchy who gets pinned down, fighting the Prussian rearguard at Wavre. The main Prussian force eludes him and is already marching to Wellington's aid. At Waterloo, Napoleon delays his attack, waiting for the ground to dry, which will make movement easier for his troops. But the lost hours will later prove costly. The battle begins around 11 a.m., when Napoleon orders a feint against Wellington's right flank at Hougoumont. He hopes Wellington will commit his reserves here, drawing them away from the centre, where the main blow will fall. But Hougomont's British and German defenders cling on desperately throughout the day. At one point, the French force their way through the main gate, but it's shut behind them, and the intruders are all killed. Wellington later calls it the decisive moment of the battle. Around noon, 80 French cannon opened fire against the main Allied line. Most of Wellington's men are out of sight on the reverse slope, but many cannonballs still find their mark, smashing bloody holes in the Allied ranks. At 1:30 p.m, Napoleon sends in his infantry. The French columns are met by disciplined musket fire, and then charged by British heavy cavalry. The French attack disintegrates as Napoleon's men try to save themselves from the crushing hooves and flashing sabres. Scores of Frenchmen are ridden down, and 2 of their famous Eagle standards are captured. But the British cavalry, exhilarated by success, charge too far. They become scattered, their horses blown. At their most vulnerable, they're countercharged by French cavalry and suffer terrible losses. Among the dead, Major General Sir William Ponsonby, commander of the Union Brigade. Around 4 p.m, Marshal Ney thinks he sees the Allies begin to retreat and leads a mass cavalry charge to drive home the advantage. But Ney is wrong. The Allied infantry are ready, formed in hollow squares with bayonets fixed. The French cavalry can't break into these impregnable formations. They can only circle impotently until they retreat or are shot from the saddle. Ney's failure to support this attack with either infantry or artillery is a serious blunder. Meanwhile, Blücher's Prussians have begun to arrive. They capture the village of Plancenoit, threatening Napoleon's flank and forcing him to send reserves to recapture it. Around 6 p.m, French infantry finally capture the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte in the center of the battlefield. It allows the French to bring forward artillery and blast the Allied squares from close range. They can't miss the closely packed formations, and casualties quickly mount. It begins to seem that if Wellington's army doesn't retreat, it will be killed where it stands. But the situation for Napoleon is also desperate. The Prussians are arriving in force, and he's running out of men to throw against Wellington's army. So he turns to his ultimate reserve, the elite Imperial Guard, the most feared troops in Europe. At 7:30 p.m, 3,000 of these battle-hardened veterans march past their emperor and across the corpse-strewn battlefield towards the Allied centre. Wellington's redcoats rise to meet them and pour devastating volleys of musket fire into their ranks. When the Allies fix bayonets and prepare to charge, the Imperial Guard wavers and then retreats. Wellington, sensing victory, orders a general advance. About the same time, the Prussians recapture Plancenoit. News of the Imperial Guard's defeat and rumours of encirclement by the Prussians sweep through the French ranks. Panic breaks out, and the French army flees the battlefield. Only Napoleon's old guard maintain their discipline, mounting a heroic but doomed rearguard action. Napoleon himself is forced to abandon his carriage and barely escapes the pursuing Prussian cavalry. The battle is won. The Duke of Wellington and Prince Blücher meet and congratulate each other outside Napoleon's former headquarters, an inn called La Belle Alliance. Blücher thinks it's the perfect name for their shared victory, but Wellington prefers the more English-sounding Waterloo, where he has his own headquarters. The Battle of Waterloo was, in the words of the Duke of Wellington, a damned near-run thing. It was also one of the bloodiest battles of the age. Around 50,000 men were killed or wounded, 23,000 coalition casualties, 27,000 French. The beginning of a period of relative peace in Europe. There were no wars between the great powers for 40 years, and the British would not fight on the continent for another 100 years, until the summer of 1914. 40 years after the battle, a pioneer in the new art of photography captured these remarkable images. They're veterans of Napoleon's armies, by then all old men in their 70s and 80s. Among them, Sergeant Tanya of the Imperial Guard, Moray of the 2nd Regiment of Hussars, and Verline of the 2nd Guard Lancers. These faces are a tantalizing link to the dramatic events that shaped the course of history 2 centuries ago.
All right. So, as we know, Napoleon has to surrender, and he goes to St. Helena now. The British send him not to the Mediterranean. They send him to an island way out here in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And that's where Napoleon dies. There's no way for him to get out of that. So, ladies and gentlemen, there you go. There's a snapshot of the Napoleonic Wars in reference to the British. Thanks a lot, and take care. Have a great summer.